Jungian psychology is ripe for existentialism. Kierkegaard has a lot to say about self-deception. He has a lot to say about how resilient our self-deceptions are. He has an awful lot to say about authenticity. You can't read Kierkegaard and not become profoundly unsettled. It's to engage with the text is to really engage with your own sense of who you are and where you are going.
Welcome to Psychology and the Cross. In this, our second episode, we will dive deep into the world of Danish philosopher and Christian existentialist Søren Kierkegaard and study his psychology in comparison to C.G Jung's. As our guide, we have Amy Cook. You most likely don't know who she is, but you really should. She has written, in my mind, one of the best books related to Jungian studies in the recent years. It's named Jung and Kierkegaard, Researching a Kindred Spirit in the Shadows, and was published by Routledge in 2018. The book is not only an excellent examination of Kierkegaard and Jung's psychologies and how they compare and differ, it's also a thought-provoking study that brings light to Jung's own struggle with faith and belief. In a Kierkegaardian manner, Amy addresses fundamental questions to the Jungian field about our relationship to knowledge, experience, religious belief and faith. It's a bold book and a necessary reading for any individual, Jungian or not, in search for truth. Amy graduated with a degree in history from the University of Aberdeen in 2005. She went on to study a master's degree in philosophy and psychoanalysis at Essex University before completing another master in Jungian and post-Jungian studies. Her PhD dissertation from Bangor University became the foundation of this, her first book. Here is our conversation.
I've always been really interested in philosophy. I was a history undergraduate, but a terrible one. So I spent all my time reading philosophers, and so it was Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. So I've always had this fondness for Kierkegaard. I just think if you're a philosophically minded teenager, you're probably going to find something of a companion in Kierkegaard. Lots of angst. And there's a lot of comfort to find in reading, even the most morose philosophies, even Schopenhauer. There's a comfort there. You're not alone. You're despairing. That's good. You're somewhere along the line of progress. Really, when I left uni, it was all about studying philosophy, and it was just by chance I returned to where I grew up in Essex, and I think Essex University is one of the few. Might be the only one actually in Britain where you can do Jungian study. But I started off with philosophy and psychoanalysis, which I loved. And then of course through that masters I become interested in Jung, as a figure. Again, coming back to this idea of there being this suffering, that you can be suffering, you can be despairing, you can be in despair. But that's not a bad thing. And that was the real hook for me, and something that I've always been fascinated with.
The people who listen to this podcast, most of them, they might have a pretty good idea about Jung and Jung's theory. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit about Kierkegaard, in regards to him maybe as a psychologist.
Kierkegaard is a figure who, for most part in philosophy, is known to be the father of existentialism. And then people may have heard of him in terms of being a very miserable and gloomy, melancholic Dane. But I don't think it's really, even though existentialism is one of the few philosophies that's really become embedded in our culture, there's very few philosophies that have made that crossover to be really felt. And you've got artists and poets and writers, all really massively infused by this philosophy. But yes, Kierkegaard is a ridiculously good psychologist. I think it's really hard to talk about Kierkegaard without talking about his personal life, because his is a lived psychology. And Kierkegaard himself never called himself a philosopher. He really didn't get on with the philosophers of his time. They were on the wrong track. So he's very much a poet and an author he says this, he says his rest and debt is to awaken his reader, is to awaken that inner truth in them, So if you're going to take one thing from Kierkegaard, it really is this reminder that existence isn't about beliefs, words, thoughts, creeds, systems. It's about you. You must let your life speak for you. It's what we do. It's what we put into action. Kierkegaard is all about not telling you how to live. He's very silent in that respect. What he does is he uses Socratic irony and very clever characters in his works that reflect a certain stage of existence, and there's a conflict between them. And so you're reading his work, and what you're seeing is you find yourself reflected back, and that's what he wants. He wants you to feel unsettled. He wants to awaken something deeper in you. I think we'll talk about Kierkegaard where he ends up, and it's not a path that I certainly would want to follow his path. It's full of pain, full of loneliness, but he seems to have found some joy in that place, because we get to the end of his life and he is very serene, and he just feels that it's his time. He's not raging against anything. He's not raging against what he died. He talks a lot. He diagnoses himself a lot. The fall in his flesh, the misrelation between his spirit and his body.
In the introduction of your book, you summarize also some point of commonalities that you find between C.G. Jung and Kierkegaard. Could you speak a little bit about that to begin with, just the commonalities that one can find in their psychological theory or life projects?
Yeah, so I think just the very common existentialist themes that run through Jung and Kierkegaard. We've got authenticity, this idea that there is an authentic self and a false self, and that common to both of them is this understanding that so many of us live in despair of the self that we are, for whatever reasons, and so self-deceptions, the resistance of our self-deceptions, we find that a common point in both their work, and I guess the passage to becoming a true self is one that involves suffering and holding on to that suffering and seeing it through, and not relegating it or seeking to medicate it away. And I kind of think, especially in today's world, not only are these ideas like completely relevant, I just think there's so much more needed.
One spirit. Spirit is the self. Considered in this way, a human being is still not a self.
Could you help us to sort of elaborate on Jung versus Kierkegaard's view of the self? Maybe starting with Kierkegaard. to see how they relate or how they might differ, their view on what it is to be a self, or what a self is then that is in becoming.
Sure. So the self in becoming is what connects them both. The self is in a state of becoming. It's becoming a self, your true self, your true authentic self, which is going to heal you. You can't develop a religious attitude without this development of self to its full potential. So the self becomes really quite a holy concept. There's a really difficult argument to make about the relational self, particularly in Kierkegaard. There is a relational self because, of course, Kierkegaard is influenced and can influence others. So there's a relationship, but ultimately the self has to relate to God, and that God is very much a transcendent God. It's very much the other. Now, Jung, and this I think where things get quite controversial for theologians, that God that exists somewhere outside of us and is a transcendental being. Well, Jung sort of puts this God into the self with a capital S. So the relationship to this God self is what matters. And I mean, that's a really, you talk about bold ideas, that's bold. You know, that immediately is not cool. It gets people's backs up, doesn't it? It's I mean, one of the wonderful things about Jung is just how wide his knowledge is of religion. You know, Kierkegaard, we don't see any further than the Christianity that he grows up in. You know, this is a Lutheran Christianity of Denmark. But Jung's not as closed off as that. So he talks about, you know, it's not so much the religion, but the religious. And that can end in the figurehead of a god, or it could be a path to salvation, or, and this is what I really, really love, it can be anything dangerous and beautiful enough to give your life meaning. And I just think that's just the most amazing statement, because of course in today so many people can't find meaning in their religions as institutionalized religions. Because both Kierkegaard and Jung, I mean, I know I've wandered off from the self, but I think this is important point, is that they are completely at a loss with institutionalized religion. You know, they both see them lacking something very, very fundamental for the development of the self. And where for Jung, this is very much the symbolic that's missing. And for Kierkegaard, you could say it's the suffering of being a Christian that's eroded, but you could also say that, you know, the Danish church had made being a Christian so easy that it really had lost the meaning. You know, it had lost its vitality. You know, being Christian for Kierkegaard isn't sitting in a comfy armchair and becoming very settled. And I think that's the state he thought a lot of his companions were in. They were under the illusion that they were Christian by being born into a Christian society and being baptized. But that's not the end of it. You know, it's your life. It's what you do. It's the essence of your existence. I suppose I've done you a disservice really by not talking about Kierkegaard's stages of existence, because it's got 3 stages, and the first of that is the aesthetic, and that's probably where most of us will find ourselves. This is really governed by pleasure. You know, we run from anything that fills us with dread. We make no commitments to ourselves or to other people. So his point is you have to hurry up and despair, because you will find no happiness until you do so. And I mean, you can just see it in our modern day culture. If people feel any kind of anxiety, they've got their mobile phone. And then it's kind of like it's almost like a dummy. You know, you get your mobile phone out and you scroll and you're on Facebook and you distract yourself. That's the point. In the aesthetic realm, you're always distracting yourself. You just don't want to sit with that restlessness that defines human nature. And I think that's a concept, this restlessness that we see in Kierkegaard and in Jung. So to kind of flip this over now to Jung, he would say that this would be, you know, how he says this, doesn't he? That I haven't seen a patient over the age of 35 whose problem wasn't to do with having lost a religious outlook, having lost this overall sense of meaning of life's purpose. Very much a second half, you know, second half project of life, isn't it? Not for everybody. Some of us make it the first half and then worry about careers later, you know. But you've got this sense of, in the aesthete phase, you're even in despair because you don't know it. And this is absolutely the most base level despair, because you're in a state of spiritlessness. And you might look at that in Jung and see something like a neurosis. There's something that is missing, you know. So whereas Jung proposes a process of individuation to come to this meaningful existence, Kierkegaard's got his stages of existence, which is a lot more dramatic. You know, each stage is mediated through a crisis. So eventually the idea is that in the aesthetic sphere, we simply can't hide from the boredom and the emptiness, and that dread will bubble up, and we'll have to start asking ourselves questions. You know, what are we going to do with our life? Who are we? Why are we here? You know, and then that's where there's a movement over to the ethical, and the ethical is pretty much that, you know, that second stage of life where you focus on careers and families, commitments. You know, it is, you know, it's very much about obligation and finding your place in society. But that can't, in the end, Kierkegaard would argue that too, the meaningless of that will too evade and evoke dread. And ultimately, you have to make that leap of faith to God, to rest transparently in God. And I think that's the point for me where I'm struggling. It's a very, very, in Kierkegaard's writing, it becomes very hard to understand because it's about the absurd. So you have to transcend the ethical in this absurd, paradoxical leap. So he talks about Abraham and Isaac, and Abraham's sacrificing of Isaac as this ultimate act of faith, because it contains this paradox. Isaac understands that he's killing Isaac will kill him, but at the same time he has this faith that God will restore Isaac back to him, which is absurd. You know, it's just not possible. But that's the embodiment of faith.
And I think you're leading us into this foundational question. I think one of them around faith versus knowledge, and Jung and Kierkegaard's respective views on that, and where they base themselves. is it something you could speak of a bit, because you write things so articulate around that in the book? I find about the question of faith versus knowledge, and as you're also quoting Jung saying in that BBC interview, I don't believe I know.
Yes, Jung's faith. I think that's a really tricky thing. I'd just be full confession. I don't understand. I don't understand where he's coming from. I mean, for Jung, he repeats a lot this idea of the original religious experience, this double aspect. And of course, I think he even says something like, I can only commune with people who have had this experience of God. And for someone who has never had an experience of God, I struggle to even imagine what it might look like. I've read the Red Book. I get the sense that is his original experience of God is in there, and I mean, I don't understand it. I mean, I wouldn't pretend to. But yes, so the BBC interview, I don't believe, I know. And it's I find it a very bizarre statement, particularly when you consider how Jung had this love for the esoteric and for paradox, and in no other scenario does he struggle with belief. You know, it's a therapist's belief and hope for that his patient can heal and progress along the stages of individuation. No problem here. But when it comes to God, he completely just obliterates the idea of belief. And it's a very strong statement. It's a really strong statement. And I just feel I can't really do a service to understanding it, because I can't come from a place where I can even conceive what he might be getting at. But in my book, I do make some conclusions about what might be going on. I think it'd be quite well known to people, Jung's issues with his dad. Well, not with his dad's as much as maybe his father's religious doubts. You know, he kind of kept imploring his dad as a child to give him he wants to know why he should believe in God. And his dad just kind of said, you just believe. And he starts to see this as quite a hollow, empty faith. He doesn't believe his father has this faith at all. He's just a bit of a lost soul, going through the motions. But then I find it hard not to see that same dogmatic response in his own statement, really.
I have a quote from your book here where you say it. You say that with his statement, "I do not believe I know," Jung is standing patronizingly so outside of his father's religion. Such statements seethe with unconscious doubt and indicate the clear need to quieten uncertainty by dogmatically defending religious experience. Faith and knowledge through personal experience exist so uncomfortably in Jung's thinking that, to my mind, this really does limit the degree to which we can view Jung as a sensitive and sympathetic spiritual pilgrim.
Yes. Well, it's just so deeply strange, isn't it? I mean, Jung, he so brings to life this dialectical process. You know, you have to hold two things in conflict to birth the third, you know. And here we find he can't hold these two things. He can't hold them. it's very much an everything and nothing response. Sorry, I just picked that up. And yeah, it's something that it's just very intriguing. I mean, my conclusion isn't by no means the only one at all.
You write there in the conclusion, although Jung believes himself to have discovered God alive and active within the unconscious, I do not think he managed to recapture his lost faith in God. It would certainly seem that his attempt to heal the split who his father and his father's religion was ultimately unsuccessful.
Gosh. Yeah, I think I kind of stand by that because, I mean, I think if you, I think it's so fundamental to, I think any religion, not just Christianity, but any religion, faith has to have doubt. You can't have an enlivened faith without doubt. And I think I struggle with, as soon as I think this is a personal problem, as soon as anybody comes at anything with any certainty, I mean, to that strength of certainty, I'd be inclined to take a step back, just instinctively, just take a step back. But then at the same time, you know, this could just be Jung's attempt to completely reimagine what Christianity is. You know, because you can be sympathetic to this idea of undergoing the original experience, whatever that is. And of course, that has to be some sort of confrontation within the unconscious. It doesn't necessarily have to lead to the conclusion that I draw. But I think maybe if we were to look at it from a Jungian, if you come up from a Jungian aspect, I think you would have to find that a troubling statement. There's no dialectical process going on here. Because there is a little bit, I mean, I know this is straying a little bit further now, but there is that aspect to analytical psychology that could be said to replace the need for religion. I mean, if you look at it as a project that one finds their self, their purpose, and meaningful existence, individuation encompasses all of that. You know, I don't know whether I'm not entirely sure that Jung's wanting to heal Christianity is as pure a motivation as it might seem. I think there is a sense, I think you really can, well, not with any certainty, there is a sense to my mind that he does go beyond Christianity and does seek to replace it with something else. But why not? There's nothing wrong with that, you know, nothing wrong with that at all.
But what would you see is left of Christianity in Jung's project then? Or what sort of left? What is Christian about this Jungian psychology as you understand it?
Very little. I mean, I don't know. It's if you look at Kierkegaard, he doesn't arrive to the faith of his Knight of Faith. He identifies himself as being a Knight of Resignation. He hasn't quite made it in terms of faith. But it's still, with Kierkegaard, you can follow. You can see where he's coming from. There is no sense of you have to be certain. And of course, the religious experience is extremely important to Kierkegaard, but it doesn't supersede belief. It doesn't, because that's the point with Kierkegaard, isn't it? Experience and belief aren't going to get you to that leap of faith that you need to get to. There's something more. There's something that is inexpressible, that you can't reduce to rational thinking. There is just something else. Whereas when Jung arrives at this point of talking about faith, that's not there anymore. There isn't any space. It's just you have the experience and you know. But it just seems so alien. How could you have any kind of experience and be so utterly sure in that experience what you have experienced? Where's the framework around it to make sense and to contemplate and reflect? And
but isn't a part of that related to his the idea of individuation or Jung's rendering of the Imitatio Christi? Like, isn't that where he speaks of the of life or faith in something that goes beyond an individual numinous experience of sorts?
You got a very different imitation of Christ in Jung. It's very individual. You carry your own cross. Don't carry Jesus's cross. You must carry your own. You know, it's a completely subjective experience. Which you know, that's probably a good thing. I don't think we want to follow Kierkegaard down his imitation of Christ, which is literally to suffer and suffer, and ape the stigmata and suffer some more and live in complete hostility to everything around you. Does not sound fun.
But you're also saying that he found peace.
Yeah, but then for Kierkegaard, these two things aren't in conflict at all. You know, it's not something that perhaps you or I could live with. I mean, to Kierkegaard, he stops going to church. He doesn't have relationships around him. He even stops taking what he refers to as his people baths, where he would walk the streets of Copenhagen and stop and have a natter with people. He stops all that because it was an incident with the magazine, a magazine there. It's a fight he started because he decided that because they liked him, he couldn't be terribly important because the magazine that took people down and kind of equivalent of our Heat magazine. So he upsets them so that they attack him. And then, of course, everybody else attacks him. And he's absolutely happy now because this is to be Christ-like. It's to be mocked and to be scorned. And if the world's not being hostile to you, you're not really living the life of Christ. So in Jung, we see a much healthier imitation of Christ. But there's no conflict here because, yes, Kierkegaard, he dies quite peacefully. He's quite serene. He's quite confident in his work. You know, this was his purpose, was to lead this body of work that was going to challenge people out of their self-deceptions and into a true life. That he, you know, that he's still melancholic. He's still a deeply angsty, anxiety-ridden individual. But that's maybe his truth. And I don't know, I just think for Kierkegaard, he always allows for there being something else.
Would you say that Jung and Kierkegaard can sort of also complement each other? I mean, the subtitle of your book is Researching a Kindred Spirit in the Shadows. Can one speak about them somehow complementing each other, or are there ways that you feel like some of Kierkegaard could give life to the Jungian world, or the other way around in your mind?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's a really tricky question. I mean, Jungian psychology is ripe for existentialism. And I think if you came at it from it doesn't have to be a strictly speaking Kierkegaardian angle, but really draw out them existential themes, I think you could have a really interesting fusion. Kierkegaard has a lot to say about self-deception. He has a lot to say about how resilient our self-deceptions are. He has an awful lot to say about authenticity. And I don't think that if you could hold the two together, that can't fail to enliven things, you know. But I think, I mean, I'm going to be a little bit provocative. But I think what Jungian psychology really needs is a Kierkegaard. You know, I mean, and I'm coming from a Kierkegaard as a Socratic figure, somebody who is going to be an absolute nuisance. I mean, Kierkegaard understood he was an absolute nuisance. He thought that was his mean. That's the whole reason he's here, being a nuisance. But he's at the same time he's challenging us. He's unsettling us. You can't read Kierkegaard and not become profoundly unsettled. You know, it's to engage with the text is to really engage with your own sense of who you are and where you are going. So to my mind, more than anything, I'd love to see analytical psychology find itself a Kierkegaard, someone who's going to shake it up a little bit, get everyone questioning things, you know, not I think there can be a tendency to always want to defend some pretty big Jungian concepts and always go back to the original writings and a little bit of hero worship, you know. Jung's great. I'm not saying he's not great.
Yeah, could we speak a little bit about Jung's critical reception of Kierkegaard and, you know, Jung's view on Kierkegaard? Because again, many people listening to this podcast, they might not know that much about it, and if they know anything, they might just know that he didn't like Kierkegaard or there was something negative.
Jung's reception of Kierkegaard is profoundly negative. He doesn't seem to see any commonalities between their projects, which is astounding, because even if you just the most basic of concepts in Kierkegaard is just it's like Kierkegaard is properly liberating. It's not about what's written down, what theories you're following, what philosophy you feel or think. It's about what you think. You know, this is your truth. Don't live somebody else's life. You can only live yours. And for his time, he is a unique voice here. emphasizing this subjective truth that is so important to individual development. And Jung, I mean, it's hard to say how much Jung actually knew of Kierkegaard, but in 1920s, Kierkegaard's really very popular. So I can't believe he didn't have a good enough knowledge of Kierkegaard. But yeah, Jung reduces him to a religious neurotic, a part of the Misery Institute that has become not Christianity altogether, but maybe just a certain kind of Protestant religion. I think that's where that Misery Institute plays in.
Because you also do interpretation or an analysis of a possible way of viewing this negative reception, and you speak of the sort of shadowy relationship between the two, or at least Kierkegaard as a sort of shadow figure to Jung.
So I think I come at Kierkegaard as a shadow figure for Jung in terms of the fact that Jung simply can't see anything positive in Kierkegaard's work. And I think it's very telling in calling him a religious neurotic that even then he can't see anything that might be vital in that, any vitality, anything positive. And of course, Jung's all about neurosis as not being this wholly negative experience. It has its own meaning, it's its own communication. And it's very much, neurosis is very much neurosis is through neurosis that we're going to arrive at a more authentic sense of our own selves. And so he just completely shuts off and closes down, writing to people that, I think he writes to Kunzli something along the lines of that, you find him frightful, warms the cockles of my heart. And I think, obviously I come from a position of thinking Kierkegaard's wonderful, and it's really not difficult to see how much of a shared project they have. There aren't they are differences, and some of them differences are big, but at the heart of it, they're so similar what they're trying to do, to awaken something that is profoundly you and you alone. And then I think this is where it gets a little bit more tenuous, is where I connect this to the relationship that each has to their fathers, and how Kierkegaard at the end of the day very much sits within his father's faith. He's resolved the difficulties that he's experienced in his father's faith. But he doesn't transgress what was a very familiar sense of faith to both him, his father, and Christianity. Whereas in Jung, we see this uncomfortable resolution of the problem of his father's faith. And I say uncomfortable, it's only uncomfortable to me. I think there's plenty of people who wouldn't see any issue with this. Of course, you want to undergo the religious experience, and that should be everything. It's just I happen to think I don't agree that it is everything. It's not the last word.
I've been wondering about the sources we have about Paul Jung's life, if they go beyond Jung's sort of description of his father's personality, or if it's mostly based on that we sort of have this image of the suffering, helpless man who never found peace. I don't know if you know.
I certainly would have to say I'm guilty of only drawing on Jung's description of his father. I've never come across anything myself in studying the PhD or even writing a book that went beyond that. But I think that's a really good point.
He writes that Jung's understanding of the Imitatio Christi carries with it the implication that traditional Christianity has misunderstood both Christ and the Incarnation. The Incarnation contains in and through the individual, who must understand that his relation to the infinite is to realize the Incarnation as an ongoing and continuing process, according to Jung. To exist as an authentic individual requires that we break away from and go beyond conventional Christianity in pursuit of a higher religion. So there we are again, also with that question of what you mentioned before: is analytical psychology sort of surpassing or replacing Christianity, or is it to be seen as a sort of reparation or a restoration of some original truth, where I would think Jesus still maybe would play some central part?
But don't you think the interesting thing is it can be both? It really just depends how you approach it. I mean, if you're somebody with a Christian disposition, you can read that statement, that the change in what it is to imitate Christ. It's not a literal imitation, it's the deepest, truest expression of Christ, but through yourself. Yeah. And that's, I mean, comparing that to how when Jung's talking about his experience of religion, I can't follow that, but I can follow this. I can follow where we're departing from conventional Christianity here. Yeah. I don't think it's that bold, but I can follow it. But in terms of whether it's a process that is about reparation or a process that's superseding religion, it's an either or, because I think that's why Jung attracts just such a wide, diverse range of people. And whether ultimately he meant it as one or the other, I think is unanswerable. Jung knows, none of us do, but he does.
But you're also speaking, but you're also referring to the dream that I discussed with Mary Stein about Max Seller's dream with the building the temple, or that each one is sort of in their analysis building an individual pillar, and Jung's prophetic interpretation of that dream as a sort of vision for a new religion to take place in 500-600 years. You refer to that dream in when you speak of the Imitatio Christi and the idea of maybe needing to break away from conventional Christianity in pursuit of a higher religion. Yeah. Do you understand Jung's project as a continuation of a sort of Christian tradition, or that it's a break with it in your mind?
My opinion is very unqualified because I'm not a Christian. But I struggle to see it as anything but a breakaway. But then I don't see that as a negative thing. I only see that as a negative thing when he's talking about belief not being necessary. It's experience over belief. I struggle. I find that quite. I think there's something quite unhealthy to that. Whereas to say to somebody, to put the emphasis on imitating Christ in a way that is very uniquely your own imitation, I really find a lot to like about that. There's an ideal there, I think, a good ideal to look up to.
An ideal?
Yeah, as in, Jung's using Christ as an example of individuation, isn't he? And the same is true for Kierkegaard. But whereas I don't see Kierkegaard's Imitatio as something to be, I certainly wouldn't advise anybody to follow him down that road. But in Jung's rendering of the Imitation, there is something a lot more gentle and perhaps even a little bit more authentic. Authentic in terms of the individual, not authentic to Christianity.